Well, Somini Sengupta is the New York Times bureau chief for the United Nations, where she covers stories on diplomats, warlords, and assorted mayhem. Her previous assignments for the New York Times include technology correspondent and bureau chief in both New Delhi and West Africa. Her most recent article, Venezuela Gets UN Seat, Turkey is Denied, covers Venezuela's acceptance into the UN and the reasons for Turkey's rejection. I have to mention that I've been following her writing for some time, and if you haven't done so, go to the Times Topics page and you can pull up Ms. Sengupta's previous reportage from the UN. I find her to be very insightful, brings a fresh perspective to the UN. One of my favorite stories had to do with why the UN doesn't work, and the reasoning being behind the fact that people care about the UN so much, which was a really interesting take on an issue that's kind of discussed over and over and over at the UN. She has also covered previous topics such as child soldiers, receding glaciers, Himalayan monarchs, technology, law, and society. She received the George Polk Award for Foreign Reporting in 2004. Born in Calcutta, Sengupta grew up in Canada and California and received a BA in English and Development Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. As I mentioned, we are appreciative of our friends at the New York Times for helping to organize today's lecture. The topic for today's lecture, ISIS, Ebola, and Bodies That Fell from the Sky, a View of Global Crises from the UN. Please join me in warmly welcoming Somini Sengupta.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for organizing this gorgeous sunshine and these colors on the leaves. It's remarkable. Let me start by telling you a story of a July morning very far from here in a country created by Americans called Liberia. It was early in the morning, the coolest part of the day, and I was in the backseat of a Jeep. We were driving past the cashew groves to the far eastern corner of Liberia to a hospital built by American missionaries in the 1930s. Dr. Joseph Kerkula, an ophthalmologist, led me through the wards, and they were unrecognizable to him this morning. Grenades had blown off part of the roof. The floors were littered with syringes and blue surgical gowns. There were bullet casings and empty crates of ammunition laying around. You see, this was July 2003. Liberia was at war. The hospital had been turned into a garrison. And the fighters had stripped the place of anything they could use, antibiotics, sterile gauze, generators, everything. This was the peak of the war, when rebels were trying to oust Charles Taylor, the warlord who controlled Liberia at the time. This was when mortars landed with no precision at all on top of hospitals, in markets, next to camps full of displaced people. This was when teenage gunmen wearing wigs and bathrobes terrorized everyone else. This was when there was no food in the market, when schools were closed and Liberians were hungry, and when they were so desperate for the international community to come and intervene and stop the war that on a day of especially fierce fighting, they brought their dead and laid them at the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Monrovia, the capital. I remember counting 18 corpses in all, including a child. The day I met Dr. Kerkula at the hospital was his first day back to the hospital in many weeks. He had kept working as the fighting got closer and closer, and one day it got so close that he had to flee. 35 patients were in the wards that day, some of them fresh out of eye surgery. He hoped that they could see well enough to run. I can't tell you how many died, Dr. Kerkula said. We were all on the run. Now, why am I telling you this long story about an obscure war 11 years ago? I'm telling you this because that war did end a few weeks after my visit to Dr. Kerkula's hospital. A new interim government was formed and a new army. International peacekeepers arrived. At their peak, there were 13,000 UN peacekeepers from Bangladesh and Jordan and Ecuador and many other countries. They were all there to restore peace and stability to the country. And it was something that the international community could feel good about. Diplomacy had worked. The United Nations sent lots of experts to help conduct elections, train the police, immunize children against childhood diseases. Taylor was persuaded to go into exile in Nigeria. And then, quite remarkably, he was prosecuted and convicted for crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Multinationals rushed back to operate Liberia's mines and rubber plantations, and by 2013, the Liberian economy was galloping. And for a while, it seemed like that vague, very hopeful concept, the international community, could feel good about itself. And so we all sort of forgot about Liberia. We congratulated ourselves. We were on our way to shutting down the peacekeeping mission there. Then, on December 6th, 2013, a toddler died in a village across the border from Dr. Kakula's hospital in the forest in Guinea. His mother died next, then his 3-year-old sister, then his grandmother. Then health workers got infected and carried it back to their villages and infected others. No one knew what to call this disease. They didn't know what it was. Everyone was terrified. There was fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and a quick, undignified death. Only in March of this year did doctors name it. And you all know what it's called now. It's called Ebola. As I speak to you now, there are more than 13,000 recorded cases, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization. At least 5,000 people are dead, the vast majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them, in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This is a moment of reckoning for the international community, and particularly for the United Nations, because if not on something as deadly as this, then what is it good for? And if not now, when the United Nations is 69 years old, then when? Ebola pulled down the curtain. It showed how unprepared the world was. The World Health Organization was terribly slow in recognizing the intensity of the disease and then doing something about it. The international pharmaceutical industry didn't bother to develop a vaccine, even though, Ebola had struck other countries over the last several years. And why didn't they develop a vaccine? Because there was no money. This was not a first world disease. Donors poured in a good deal of money into rebuilding war-torn West Africa, but not nearly enough to build a functioning healthcare system. In August, finally, the WHO declared Ebola in West Africa to be an international public health emergency. And in the corridors of the United Nations, it became apparent that Ebola could well add to a list of crises that the international community had failed to stop. This is a long list that you know of already. It includes the 1994 genocide in Rwanda to a cholera outbreak in Haiti that the UN itself was accused of bringing. So, this year in September, the Security Council, which usually doesn't pronounce on health matters, declared Ebola to be a threat to peace and security. And Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, pressed presidents and prime ministers all over the world to rally in support of the Ebola-affected countries. Money, helicopters, nurses, doctors, hazmat suits, they needed everything. Indeed, it soon became our problem, not just their problem. This week, I got a note from my kids' school in New York City. If you've been to the affected countries and are experiencing symptoms, the note said, go see a doctor. It was an unusual moment because I usually keep these two worlds kind of partitioned in my brain. There's the world of guns, germs, and diplomacy, which I cover at the United Nations, and then there's the health of my family. But now they couldn't be partitioned. It was a very, very vivid illustration of why what happens out there in the world can bear so directly on our immediate community. And equally, why the international community, that vague, kind of hopeful slogan, can matter. So what is the United Nations? What does it do? Why does it matter? And forgive me if you know all of this already. Let's just kind of review a little bit what we're talking about. So what's the United Nations? My daughter says the United Nations is a bunch of people who talk all the time, and she finds this really boring, which is kind of accurate. I also find them kind of boring sometimes. The UN has a whole lot of tentacles doing a whole lot of things out in the world. It appoints investigators to ferret out what happens in North Korean prison camps. It runs schools in Gaza. It tries to stop wars. It tries to persuade countries to curb emissions, to address climate change, and it feeds people. Last year, in 2013, the World Food Program fed 80 million people around the world. Some people think of the UN as the world's conscience. This is sort of accurate too, but you need to put into the mix something else, something really important. The UN is fundamentally an ensemble of nation states, and every country is there to advance its own interests, to help itself, to help its friends, and to embarrass and isolate its foes. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It is what it is. It's what makes the UN tick. It's what makes it effective sometimes and totally ineffective other times. So as you all know, it started in 1945. It was made up of 51 countries at the time. Anyone know where the United Nations met for the first time to draft its charter? Anyone? Very good. San Francisco, city by the bay. Now, 69 years later, the UN has 193 member states, from 51 in 1945 to 193. What happened? Anyone? What happened first? 1960s and 70s. Come on, take a guess. That's a good connection. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, colonialism ended. It was freedom time. Countries became free. And then, the end of the Soviet Union, a bunch of new countries came up. What's the youngest country in the world, the newest member state? South Sudan, a country that the United States, incidentally, was very important in creating. And as soon as it was born, it fell into war. And the UN is back in the South Sudan. So, all these countries, every member state, all 193 belong to the General Assembly. That's how the UN works. Every country has a vote. It passes a whole lot of resolutions, the General Assembly, but they're not legally binding. They might carry some moral suasion, but they're not legally binding. The power of the UN rests with the Security Council. Its edicts can be legally binding. It can enforce its decisions if it wants to, so it can authorize the use of force against a country. It can decide who is bad enough to be sanctioned, so it can sanction entire countries, North Korea, Iran, or it can sanction individuals. So now there are hundreds who face UN sanctions. They're barred from traveling, their bank accounts are frozen, and it's very difficult to get off a sanctions list once you're on. And every now and then there's a little announcement that so-and-so, some Taliban commander, is off the sanctions list. Why? Because he died 2 years ago. It's one way to get off the sanctions list. All of that to say, the Security Council has some power. It's got some big sticks. The Council sits around that famous horseshoe-shaped table. It has 15 members, 10 of whom rotate for 2 years, and 5 of whom are permanent. The P5, the big cheese, or as I've heard them called once, the 5 warlords. Those 5, as you know, are Britain, France, the United States, Russia, and China. And each of them has something that's like Zeus's thunderbolt. They can veto anything they want. And they do. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States has vetoed 14 draft resolutions, most of them involving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Russia has vetoed 11 draft resolutions concerning its allies, like the government of Syria. Ebola is the latest crisis on the Council's agenda, though by no means the only one. So let's take a look at a few of the others. How has it handled the others, and what does it say about the way it operates and how well it operates? So let me tell you a couple of stories. Last December, when the first Ebola cases were popping up, remember in that village in Guinea and no one knew what to call it, it was around that time that I flew to the Central African Republic with the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power. The Central African Republic is a former French colony that was tearing itself apart at the time. Christian and Muslim militia were attacking each other's communities, and human rights advocates were warning of the prospect of a genocide. The Council, surprisingly, fairly quickly, took decisive action. It authorized the creation of a peacekeeping force, a brand new peacekeeping force, which would cost money. Why did they do that? Because no major power, no one on that council wanted to be blamed for ignoring another Rwanda, and that too in the heart of Africa. And here's the paradox. It helped that really none of the major world powers, not the United States, not Russia, not China, had really much of a stake in the Central African Republic. They didn't have much of a reason to say no to UN intervention. It cost a bit of money, but it was okay. It was a whole lot cheaper than sending in, your own troops. So they authorized this UN force. And the French ambassador, the former French ambassador to the UN, he explained it to me this way. He said, quote, "When you have a crisis where a major power has a national interest involved, they will try to block interference by the Security Council. The UN," he said, and I'm quoting him, "the UN is in charge of crises that matter to nobody." And by nobody, he meant major world powers. Which brings me to two of the biggest crises that the international community has faced in recent months, Syria and Ukraine. Now, those two crises matter a lot to the two big, powerful countries in the world, the United States and Russia. First, Syria. Syria, many would say, marks a new level of dysfunction on the part of the Security Council. The war is now in its fourth year. The death toll is close to an estimated 200,000 people. There is compelling evidence of crimes against humanity, both by forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad and some of his opponents, namely ISIS. And still, the world powers have been totally unable to stop the war. There hasn't been peace talks in over 2 years, and 2 seasoned mediators, including the former Secretary General, Kofi Annan, have tried, and they've thrown in the towel. They've said, we can't bring the two parties to actually talk seriously about a political solution. Not just that, not just stopping the war. For months, members of the Security Council bickered and bickered over who was to blame, which side, Assad or the rebels, for blocking the delivery of humanitarian aid. Is it that the world powers didn't care? No, exactly the opposite. They cared too much. Russia and the United States cared an awful lot about what happens in Syria and who's in charge. So Russia is a very staunch backer of the Assad regime. It has cast 4 vetoes on 4 Syria-related resolutions. From the very beginning of the war, it's called all the opposition groups terrorists. And so for months, this deadlock between Russia and the West meant that the Council was deadlocked just on the question of delivering aid, just on the question of how to get food and medicine to people stuck behind the front line inside Syria. And Assad's government refused to let UN trucks carrying food and medicine into opposition-held areas. He only let food and medicine get delivered into areas that he controlled, in effect using starvation as a tactic of war, which is illegal. It's just patently illegal under international law. Still, the Council could do nothing. And Jan Egeland, who's a Swedish diplomat who used to run the UN's humanitarian relief agency, said, "We are back to the bleakest days of the Security Council since the Cold War." The crisis over Ukraine made matters worse. Early this year came Russia's military advance into Crimea, and then a very hastily organized referendum in which Crimeans voted to break away from Ukraine, and then the Russia-West split was wide open. Then in July, a Malaysian Airlines jetliner exploded 30,000 feet in the air and came crashing down into wheat fields in eastern Ukraine. There were nearly 300 passengers on board. They were killed instantly. My colleague who rushed to the scene that morning spoke to residents who described bodies falling from the sky, quote, looking like rags or clumps of ash before the plane came to a jolting rest. She wrote, and I quote, mundane items of daily life covered the grass. Toiletries spilled out of overnight bags, Nivea cream, a razor, white slippers, a glass bottle of cologne. Even by the standards of war and peace, this was anything but mundane. And as you well know, the blame game began. The US blamed Russia for arming separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. Russia blamed Ukraine, saying it happened on its territory. By September, there were European sanctions against Russia. And inside Ukraine, 1 million people were displaced. By that time, we began hearing about the beheadings. A group that called itself Islamic State in Iraq and Syria were executing American journalists. The first one, James Foley, was killed in mid-August. Then a British aid worker, then a Frenchman, and all of these beheadings, as you know, the gory videos were posted online. ISIS seized oil fields, commandeered weapons that the US military had left behind in Iraq. To religious minorities in Iraq, particularly the Yazidis, it offered a very stark choice: convert or be killed. And a senior UN official last week told me he spoke to Yazidis and other religious minorities on the ground, and he said he thought there was plenty of evidence to conclude attempts to commit genocide. So the rise of ISIS has prompted the US to return to Iraq once more, 11 years after the invasion in 2003. And it's also compelled Washington to rally the international community to its side, not just the world powers, not just Russia and the European countries, but much more importantly, Washington now is looking to countries in the Middle East who are wrangling for power in their own neighborhood. So these power struggles have now totally burst into the open. The US sees Turkey as being really vital to its efforts to combat ISIS. Turkey, is playing a hard bargain. It does not want the world to go in after ISIS only and not go after Assad, which is its primary foe in the region. And then there's Iran, which is Turkey's rival in the region. Iran is mortally threatened by ISIS. It's offered its help in a way, but it wants its pound of flesh. It wants a nuclear deal with the West. It wants sanctions lifted. So you're seeing now the international community really relying on the cooperation of these regional allies and the power struggle in the neighborhood. ISIS is truly a new kind of threat. It's a transnational organization. It's brutal. It's able to leverage technology to spread its message. And it's been successful in recruiting men and women from all over the world. They come from Australia, Belgium, Germany, Tunisia, some 80 different countries, according to some independent scholars who study foreign fighters in Syria. In September, the Security Council passed a legally binding resolution demanding that every country around the world take steps to stop the flow of fighters into terrorist groups. So again, it's not just their problem over there, it's our problem. So where do we stand now? I sometimes wonder, my daughter is 6 years old, and I sometimes wonder if she will come of age in a world that's not just falling apart, but in which there's very little clarity about who to blame. I mean, during the Cold War, there was some clarity, right? The Soviet bloc could blame the Americans could blame the Soviets. Even after September 11th, there was a new enemy to blame. But now, as you've just heard me talk about, there's an insurrection here, a beheading there. There's climate change that the UN now says we have to adapt to. There's Ebola. It's pretty scary, right? So Should we all just live in fear? Will my kid grow up and come of age driven by fear? That would be a terrible mistake, in my opinion, for two reasons. Living in fear is no way to live. It's a useless motivator. Equally, it would be a mistake because it's not grounded in facts. Why? Because contrary to all this doom and gloom that you've heard me just talk about, we actually may be living in the most peaceful, prosperous, healthiest time in the history of the human species. These are the conclusions of a cognitive psychologist who is named Steven Pinker, who you might have heard of, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he urged us, very provocatively, to ask not what's the world coming to, but how bad was the world in the past? And by past, he means thousands of years. And so the answers that he found might surprise you. He found that the world was really, really bad, really quite brutal in the past. He turned first to the work of forensic archaeologists who had found skeletons that were buried in these ancient sites. And these burials showed that skulls had been bashed and there were decapitations. Then Pinker fast-forwarded to the Middle Ages in Europe. And in Europe, he writes, so many people had their noses cut off that medical textbooks speculated about techniques for growing them back. I mean, this was, a violent, brutal time. More recently, since the end of the Second World War and the creation of the United Nations, the world powers have not gone to war with each other. Indeed, nation states in general are far less likely to be at war with one another than ever before. True, there are internal conflicts, there are civil wars, but those wars, by and large, they're awful, but they by and large kill fewer people than the big interstate wars that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. Indeed, there's another study that shows that since the end of the Cold War, the deadliest conflicts, that is to say, those that kill at least 1,000 people a year, had declined by a half since the early 90s. So here's an aside. Here's something to think about that I came across just a few weeks ago. We've been talking about, killings on the battlefield. We've been talking about war. For every person killed on the battlefield today, 9 people are killed in everyday violence, and that includes domestic violence. It costs the world close to $9 trillion a year. It's about 11% of world GDP. Isn't that amazing? And most of that $9 trillion, the vast majority of that, is this everyday interpersonal violence. So back to Pinker, who's saying we live in the most peaceful time, in human existence. Not everyone agrees, but I do think it's a provocative argument. I think it's something that we can think about. Because if you go back thousands of years, Steven Pinker argues, you might see the world a little differently. He says, and I quote, "The past seems less innocent, the present less sinister. And as I remind myself when I walk my kid to school in the morning, the future seems a little less of a thing to fear." So I thank you.
One of the great things I always tell my students about studying the UN is you can virtually touch on any topic or any issue. And so you may get some wide-ranging questions, but we have some time for questions now. We'd invite you to come up to this microphone here, form a queue. Tell us your name and what you're studying, and we have about 10 or 15 minutes, so the time is yours to ask Ms. Sengupta anything you'd like.
Ask me anything. It doesn't have to be about the UN, yeah. Feel free.
Please. First question's always the hardest, so get it going for us.
Hi, my name is Haley Peterson. I'm studying international relations. I know you mentioned Central African Republic, and how do you think the UN can solve problems like religious disputes between the Seleka and the anti-Balaka?
It's an excellent question. The UN is struggling to fully staff a peacekeeping mission that's been authorized. I think they're supposed to get on the ground something like 12,000 soldiers, which in a country as vast as the Central African Republic may not be enough, but they still don't have quite 12,000 soldiers. You know, that's one way, but also this is a country where government authority has completely collapsed. So I think one of the challenges for the UN and for the peacekeeping mission will not just be to keep the warring militias at bay, but to actually build up institutions, you know, to get the police force working again and to pay police officers, to get the jails working again, to help the country hold elections and a government that people consider to be legitimate. So all of these are, you know, are enormous challenges. And then I think there's an open question about to what extent is it important for there to be accountability for these terrible crimes that have been committed? And not everyone is on the same side on this. You know, there are people who say prosecuting war crimes and sending people to the International Criminal Court is not conducive to reconciliation. What you want are people, you know, forgiving each other on the ground. I mean, that's for every country to decide. But the Central African Republic, its government, has signed the treaty that created the International Criminal Court, which means that if the ICC wants to investigate, it does have, you know, the authority of the government, essentially, to investigate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm James Hodgson, studying political science. While this isn't really a new idea, I was just wondering, what do you think it would take to have Security Council reform, especially in terms of extending the veto power?
Oh God, you guys are like really on the ball. Security Council reform. I thought I was not going to be so wonky up here, but okay. Let me wonk. There's like a cottage industry of people debating Security Council reform. I try to write as little as possible about it because I fear it, you know, like readers aren't interested, but clearly we have a reader who's interested. There's two aspects to Security Council reform, and I think they're both equally important. There's a major push to make the Security Council look a little bit more representative of the world. I mean, you know, the permanent members are Britain, France, China, Russia, and the US. I mean, really? In 2014? You know, there are other world powers. We're not living at the end of the Second World War. So there's one, I think, very compelling argument to broaden the representation of the permanent members. It remains to be seen whether they're going to be any better, you know, any more well-behaved, any more, you know, proactive. But frankly, I mean, seeing what the council, how it performed in the war on Syria, it's hard to imagine that they would be much worse. But they may not be able to pull themselves together any better. I don't know. So that's one, kind of expanding the membership of the Security Council. And of course, countries are, you know, have been lobbying hard for years to do this. The other, I think, is more complicated, and that is kind of changing the rules of the game. Because as I mentioned, the council, the permanent members of the council, have this really powerful weapon, the right to veto. And they use it. And the question is, you know, should they be limited from using it? France has proposed, I think it's a very interesting proposal, that they sort of voluntarily agree to refrain from using the veto where mass atrocities are involved. Now, you know, are they going to give up this incredibly powerful weapon that they have voluntarily? They don't seem to be ready to give it up. France has agreed. It's persuaded Britain to agree. But the major world powers, US, Russia, and China, you know, I'm not seeing any hands up yet.
Hi, my name is Pam Grace, and I work in the library and cataloging. And my question is, I was attending a conference in Kansas City midweek last week. And so in the evening, I spent a lot more time watching CNN than I normally do. And the one evening was about the outbreak of Ebola and the doctor that had tested positive in New York City. And since then, I've been home. I used to work in the medical community as a purchasing director, but the doctor I used to work for is sending out all this Facebook messages saying, you know, that Target's starting a campaign to raise funds to find a cure or a vaccine for Ebola, and now there seems to be more concern. But my question is, you know, with raising children and how much harder it was to get penicillin and antibiotics because there are new strains of bacteria that develop a resistance. And that is kind of what is striking me about Ebola, how we haven't seen this spread with certain precautions, that maybe it has mutated, and I don't know. What are the thoughts there? And I agree, it's horrible that we've let it reside in third world countries all these years, and it's only when it crosses boundaries that it is this massive outcry.
So just two thoughts on that. You know, Ebola is not brand new. It's new to West Africa, but it's not brand new. And countries in the past have contained it. So they know how to contain it. It can have actually quite a promising survival rate. The other thought is, yes, on the vaccines, I think I mentioned, you know, they are doing clinical trials now. They're sending vaccines to the Ebola-affected countries through the WHO in the coming weeks. It could actually get there by the end of the year. On Ebola, on the response to Ebola in this country, it's worth keeping in mind that this quarantine that we hear about, you know, pushes to quarantine health workers who are coming back. That word quarantine comes from the Italian, as I understand it, quaranta, I'm mispronouncing it, which means 40. And it comes from the 40 days that people who were coming into Venice by ship during the plague in the 17th century, they were prohibited from disembarking for 40 days. That's where quarantine comes from. It really comes from another era. It's pretty hard to do quarantine successfully these days. You know, it does seem a bit anachronistic. So if you look at countries that have successfully contained Ebola, they have done so by containing where the problem is. So even Nigeria, you know, which is not a first world country, Senegal, not a first world country, they took their Ebola cases, right, the confirmed cases of Ebola, they made sure that those health workers were protected, that the patients did not leave safe places where they were cared for. They did an amazing job of tracing everyone that patient had contact with while you know, they were infectious, and they contained it. You know, if Nigeria could contain it, it's possible.
Thank you.
Hi, Brandon Garcia, molecular biology. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what you know about the strategy that the UN's taken to help contain and fight Ebola. You've mentioned a little bit about like what's going on in Africa, and you know, it kind of seems like it's really only flared up a little bit because we've had a couple of cases come over from the US. So could you tell us a little bit more about what's going on in the UN as far as the Ebola and other viruses as such?
Yeah, I mean, it's a moving target, you know, in the sense that the United Nations is reacting now, I think in a very concerted way. What it has done, for the first time, it's set up an emergency health response mission to coordinate the global response to Ebola in West Africa. So there's a new mission that is trying to coordinate who's sending helicopters, who's sending troops to build treatment centers, who's sending nurses, and trying to get them where they are most needed. Most of all, it's trying to get countries to still do more and to come up with more money for a trust fund that the UN can use as needed to help these countries contain Ebola, and also just to send material and staff. The biggest need right now, as far as I can tell, is trained infectious diseases, doctors, and nurses to those countries where they're needed. So, there's a need for beds. So, we have our soldiers, U.S. soldiers are now building treatment centers, but you can build all the treatment centers you want. If you don't have qualified staff to run them, they don't do a lot of good. So the UN is still, going around trying to get countries to do much more.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that, belatedly? Sorry. Just this, that if Ebola revealed how fragile these countries were, right? Not just their health systems, but their governments were fragile. The legitimacy of those governments were called into question. I mean, there were riots on the street. There was people were hiding their sick relatives because they didn't trust what would happen to them when they go into the hospitals. This is a long-term thing to fix. It's one thing to contain. The immediate need, certainly, is to contain the epidemic. However, there's a much longer-term challenge ahead, which is to rebuild the health systems, to get the economy going again, and just simple things like to get measles immunization campaigns back on track. There was supposed to be in Liberia a measles immunization campaign that got off the ground this November. That's been postponed. They can't conduct this immunization campaign. So something, as treatable, as preventable, not treatable, something as preventable as measles, little kids, through no fault of their own, are going to fall prey to this.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. So there's a lot of criticism about the United Nations.
What's your name?
Oh, sorry about that. I'm Colin Snyder, studying economics. There's a lot of criticism about the United Nations as far as ranging from it's ineffective to it's inefficient. My favorite's John Bolton, who said you could take off the top 10 floors of the United Nations building and it wouldn't make a difference. Do you agree with some of those criticisms? And also, if you had the power to change something in the United Nations, what is it that you would change to make it, maybe more effective or more efficient?
It's a good thing that my job does not require me to make broad pronouncements like that, because I think that broad pronouncements are usually they're not always rooted in fact, and so I don't know how to answer that question. I do know that there is this kind of recurrent criticism of the United Nations, and on particular issues, that criticism is deserved. I made some criticism of a particular organ of the UN today, the Security Council. Also the criticism against the World Health Organization and its delay in responding to Ebola, I think is quite grounded in fact. What was the second part of your question? If you could change something. Oh, if I could change something, yeah. It's not for me to say. I am a journalist. I am there to tell you and the rest of my readers the good, bad, and ugly of the institution that I cover. And I'm accountable to my readers. So, my job is not to make the UN look good or look bad. My job is to tell you what's happening and why it matters to you.
And with that, let's join me in thanking Somini Sengupta.